Here's a guy who thinks there are good reasons to believe that Jesus rose from the dead.
Objection number 1. Men wrote the Bible. That's obviously true. But isn't that true of everything you read?
Well, yeah, that's why I don't hold anything I read to be infallible.
From the New York Times to a college textbook? The fact that the Bible was written by men is not an automatic disqualifier of its truthfulness. Really, we've got to know, were those men telling the truth? To answer that, we've got to ask a follow-up question. Would men write something they knew would get them killed? And they did. 11 out of 12 of Jesus' disciples were put to death for their beliefs, and the 12th died in exile. None of them recanted a single word that they wrote about Jesus' claims of divinity or his bodily resurrection. In fact, by holding fast their witness, they gained only poverty, exclusion, and death. So ask yourself, if the disciples were lying, why would they let themselves be murdered for something they knew wasn't true? The answer is, they knew it to be true, and they sought to tell everyone they knew, despite the terminal consequences.
If you could show that they really died for their beliefs, that could be a good argument that they were convinced that they're true, but that's very different from knowing them to be true. And I'm not sure you can even show that they died for their beliefs. Here's what the New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman said about that argument when William Lane Craig made it.
And an earlier point that Bill made, that the disciples were all willing to die for their faith. I didn't hear one piece of evidence for that. I hear that claim a lot, but having read every Christian source from the first 500 years of Christianity, I'd like him to tell us what the piece of evidence is that the disciples died for their belief in the resurrection.
It's entirely plausible, given that Jesus sought to overthrow the Roman occupation of Judea, that his followers were put to death for that reason, but I've never heard any evidence that they died specifically for their belief that Jesus rose from the dead.
Objection number 2. The Bible has mistakes. The truth is, the manuscript of the Bible does have apparent errors, but they are just that, apparent. Most of these mistakes are just modest spelling errors or variants, like the difference between theater and theatre. I really don't know if I said that right. But what we don't see is major contradictions between copies of the text, like Jesus claiming to be God in one manuscript, but in another he doesn't.
Well, you do have contradictions within the text itself. For example, when it says that the women who found the empty tomb told no one about it. Mark 16:8 says, "Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." That's a self-contradictory statement, because if they told no one, then how did the author of Mark find out about it? This passage is also contradicted by the later written Gospel of Matthew, which says the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. And Luke, which says, when they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others.
And we can clearly see these slips of the pen because we have so many copies of the original text to compare them to. We know what the original said. But that leads us to our final objection. Objection number 3. The Bible is really, really old. Yes, it is.
I've never heard anyone argue that we shouldn't trust the Bible because it's old. I've heard that we shouldn't trust it because lots of it is comprised of stories that passed around orally for years before being written down. That gives lots of time for inventions to creep in before the first manuscript is even written. Consistency across manuscripts tells us nothing about what changes people made to the story before the first manuscript was written in the first place.
But so is Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. Interestingly, Caesar's Gallic Wars has 10 manuscripts that were written 1,000 years after the life of Julius Caesar. The Bible, on the other hand, has over 6,000 manuscripts of the New Testament that we can trace back to being written within decades of the life of Jesus.
Yeah, but Gallic Wars wasn't a story passed around orally for years before being written down for the first time. The Gospels were. The Gallic Wars was written down by Caesar. Sure, we don't have his original manuscript, but we can be much more confident that the story we have is a first-hand account. The Gospels, while attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are all anonymous. None of the authors tell us what their names were. We therefore can't give them the same status as a first-hand account.
But no one ever questioned the truthfulness of Caesar's Gallic Wars. You've got to ask, why is that?
I doubt very much that nobody ever questioned its authenticity. It would be weird if the oldest manuscripts that we have were not subjected to some form of authentication process. And even if nobody ever questioned the authenticity of the manuscripts, it certainly isn't the case that nobody questioned Caesar's account. Historians dispute many of the claims Caesar makes in that book.
So, knowing the authors died attesting to the truthfulness of the Bible, leaving behind thousands of nearly identical copies, save a few misspellings, it's clear this book is what it claims to be, the Word of God.
That doesn't follow at all. Even if we could be certain that the manuscripts we have reliably convey the original story, and even if they are telling the truth about Jesus returning from the dead, it wouldn't follow that they were therefore the Word of God. Even if Jesus really did have the power to come back to life, it would still be quite a leap of logic to then infer that he is therefore the all-powerful creator of the universe. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.